So, welcome to this talk. I'd put that there. Thank you, Carolina, and thank you, folks, for coming along this afternoon. It's very nice to meet you. As Carolina said, I've been teaching maths for 13 years now. This will be my 13th year. I'm currently head of maths at the High School of Glasgow, and over the last couple of years, I've also had the job of research lead. I've got 85 slides, so it's half my normal amount for an hour, so I've really cut back today. The whole presentation is already online, so you don't need to scribble down frantically any notes if you don't want to. The presentation you can find, I'll show you where to find it in a minute actually, but before I actually begin, it's important that I say hello, which I've just done. As I was saying, maths180.com, that's my website. Carolina said you can follow me on Twitter at maths180, and if you go to maths180 and just hit the more drop down here, teachers and presentations, then all of the presentations, workshops, keynotes and things that I've done over the last few years are all available there, and essentially they're all the same slides, just in different orders. The jokes are all the same as well. So today's is already up there, so if you want to follow along with Stuart, you could actually get your device out right now and follow along. I was just mentioning to Carolina there, this is probably going to be the last talk I do in Scotland for a while, because I've got a job at an international school in Marbella in Spain, so my wife and I are heading out there in the summer. But I really wanted to come across today and just share with you some of the stuff that I've been doing, that we've been doing in our school, things that are really exciting for me and for my colleagues and for the learners as well. So I'll start with that. Which is a bit of a shocking statistic, I think. Joe Bowler conducted a survey of 1,100 kids there, and I don't like that. I don't like the fact that doing maths makes the majority of Scotland's kids feel nervous. I don't think it should be like that. Doing maths should make you feel joyful and empowered. In the same survey, I don't know, you have to do a lot of soul searching and ask yourself, have I ever actually felt like that? What do I have to do for you to make progress? I don't know if you've read this book or have seen any of Anders Ericsson's work, but there's just a quote that just stood out to me from that book. And I refuse to believe that people can't learn maths. I just don't want to believe that people can't make progress and succeed with maths. So that quote really helped me. I don't necessarily like this idea of you have potential and you reach it. It's more that you build your own potential, and that growth is possible, and it really all comes down to hard work and the way that you work, intelligent practice. So before I go any further, just wanted a quick poll of your background. How many of you are classroom teachers just now? And I think I've met a few of you before, and it's nice to see some familiar faces again. And from the university, so keep your hand up if you're a student. Okay, you're just a bit of everything. So most of you may be lecturers or teachers. Okay, fantastic, that is great. Well, after I read Anders Ericsson's book, I started to get a little bit more interested in cognitive science and educational psychology. And maybe some of those words are familiar to you, but to be honest, it is quite confusing. And I think a lot of teachers just don't have the time to really understand what's going on, which is why I've been so fortunate to get that role as research lead, to try and get my head around what can classroom teachers take from cognitive science and try and embed into the classroom. Now, there are many, many models of learning, but I tend to keep gravitating back to this one. I quite like this for its simplicity. Learning here is a function of memory, knowledge, and motivation. And if you're interested in reading more about that, the Unified Learning Model is an 80-page beauty, which covers all of this. It really is a fantastic read. So I'm really only going to talk about knowledge and memory today. Motivation is a whole other can of worms that I'm not going to open up for you today. Really just going to focus on memory and on knowledge. I'm a big fan of the idea of a knowledge-driven curriculum. I think that if you don't know facts, if you don't know things, then it's very hard to think creatively and constructively about anything. You need to have some knowledge within a domain before you can then use that knowledge to think more deeply about how things are connected and how things work. And more specifically into maths, there's a lot of complex subjects that we expect children to learn through schooling, but I do believe that maths is certainly one of the most, if not the most, interdependent and hierarchical body of knowledge that we expect kids to learn. They're doing it basically their entire schooling. They start it in kindergarten, even preschool or even before they go to school at all, and it follows them all the way through till they leave. It's a huge amount of content that they've got to get through. And sometimes I struggle to figure out how some pupils leave school at 16 with such a low level of mathematical knowledge, given all the time that's been spent on it. So I'm starting to question, is the model that we're using or the approaches that we're using really the most effective? Now, a lot of teaching is sort of transcended down over the years and over the generations. So a lot of teaching is as it was 2 generations, 3 generations ago. That folk teaching is hard to break, and it's difficult to bring it into question, but there's more and more evidence coming our way that suggests that maybe we should think more seriously and think a little harder about how we're approaching things. So today I'm going to look at 3 things, primarily retrieval practice, tell you a little bit about that and how I'm using that in the classroom. I'm also going to have a little look at interleaving and some of the latest research on interleaving and how we can use that in the classroom, and spaced practice, which are 3 of the most heavily evidence-backed strategies that can improve memory and improve learning in the classroom. So I always say this is part of our role, and I mean the role of a teacher, because the role of a teacher is multifaceted, as you know. There's a pastoral element to it. There's everything else that goes along with working with young people and working with learners, but certainly part of our role is to try and build these increasingly complex knowledge structures. Now, since I've got my fancy presenter, what we can see here is some knowledge vaguely connected, but not really that interconnected, whereas over here in this model we can see the little blue dots are items of knowledge, and there's a lot more connections going on there, building what students know into what we call schema, so a rich interconnected network of knowledge. And that's really our aim, is to try and develop wider and stronger schema when it comes through learning. The maths in itself is full of concepts, and concept learning and concept formation is different from learning facts. Figuring out why something works is different to just knowing a fact about something. And I don't want pupils to go through the maths journey seeing it as a collection of facts, because it's not. And again, we're talking about that hierarchical nature. So to understand a higher order concept, we need to be really secure in the subordinate concepts that underpin it. And I'll show you what I mean in just a second on that. But this is really important when we come back to the retrieval and the interleaving and everything that I'm going to talk about later. This idea of almost like a pyramid structure of learning maths, where these lower layers need to be really secure. So that's true. I'm afraid that is true. And I can see a few of you nodding in agreement. And we really want to try and get away from that, because so much of maths is actually interconnected. And when people's eyes are opened and when they use their own awareness to realise the connections that are there, suddenly maths doesn't become such a behemoth of different skills and different techniques, because a lot of them have overlap, a lot of them are similar. And we can say, well, actually that's very much like the thing I solved the other day, just in a different context. So then we're applying the same sort of thinking to solve it. So a lot of students, unfortunately, see maths as a series of unrelated procedures. And sometimes that's because that's the way it's taught and the way it's been taught for generations. But it doesn't have to be. So let's take a nice simple example. This is something quite straightforward that actually many primary pupils would be tackling at some stage. Primary 5, primary 6, something like that. And it looks like it's quite innocent, but it isn't. Because if you think about the concept of adding fractions and being able to have success with adding fractions, there needs to be some things that underpin that. There needs to be things that you can do before you can actually move on to adding fractions. Things like these. Now, this is just my interpretation of things that feed into adding fractions, this idea of simplifying, common denominator, just addition facts in general. So they're all connected in here. You can see a web forming. But of course, all of these concepts and skills have got things that feed into them. So everything around the outside needs to be in place before we can work toward getting what I just described as some quite simple, essentially mathematical concept. And then it's worth remembering that all of these things will have little connections to other bits of knowledge as well. So for me, that's a sort of visual representation of a schema, of a way that we're connecting up bits of knowledge. If a pupil sees this as a series of unrelated procedures and facts, then they're never going to see the bigger picture. And I think it's really important that we consider that when we're teaching things like adding fractions. And that's why it's so important that things like a solid understanding of multiples is available to pupils. Or something like being able to work with improper fractions is available, has been remembered, and has been learnt. Because moving on to something like this with gaps all over the page here is going to make it so much harder for them. And that's just adding fractions. I think there's an exercise that you can do and put any sort of concept in there, and try and think about the schema or the web of subordinate concepts that feed into it, and then use that when you're planning lessons. That slide's just there because I like that. And, I think maths is something that happens, that you do, that you're party to, you need to be engaged with in some way. It's not a passive subject, it's something that you're actually actively involved in. And I mentioned that idea of awareness before. To make maths a little bit easier, pupils should be encouraged to use their own awareness to try and see what is happening, to make sense of what is going on. Sometimes that is referred to as mathematization, which I really like, sort of putting a structure on something which seemingly had no structure to it beforehand. One of the reasons that I think pupils find maths hard is because of that abstract nature of so much of it. In some senses, the symbolic representation that we use throughout maths is very abstract too. Now, there are learners in Scotland, without a doubt, who see the symbol for a 4, but don't feel 4-ness. They don't have that feeling of quantity. They see a 5. They know that they come in a sequence 4, 5, but if you're a maths teacher, this is very hard to get your head around because we just feel quantity. We just know 7 is bigger than 3. But for some pupils, even the symbols that we use are so abstract that it takes it away from the tangible and relatable sense behind all of maths. So we can count 7, but we can't count x. We just take this step into the abstract and it becomes we can see and feel what it means to add 3. What about subtracting -3? Is that as easy to see and feel? Well, I've been doing quite a lot of work with algebra tiles, and actually you can see and feel subtracting -3, but that's a complicated story and maybe a presentation for another time. Ever felt like that? Oh, I have. Maybe not tipped the desk over, but I taught them that. They were all taught that last term. Well, maybe they were taught it, but did they learn it? That's the big question. And if they learnt it, how long have they retained it for? Have they forgotten it? Was it learning? Was it just performance at the time? That's why end of topic tests should go. Never do an end of topic test, because all that you're measuring there is performance. Now, of course, you could do it, and at least you'll know that they can do it at that time, but you've no guarantee that they're going to be able to do it in 4 weeks or 4 months after that. Austin's quote. So, memory is complicated, and there are various models of memory on the go. I'm going to talk through one of them just now, but it's fickle. It is hard, and you know that yourself. That time when you've had something on the tip of your tongue, trying to remember the name of the actor that was in that film or whatever it is. Oh, I can't remember what it is. And then 4 hours later when you're doing the dishes, it just drops right in there. It was always in there. It was always in there, but you just couldn't retrieve it at the time. So no presentation on memories complete without this guy, old Hermann Ebbinghaus, and his famous forgetting curve, which is not really that surprising. If you know something and then you wait some time, you will gradually start to forget it. Ebbinghaus, you might know all about him, but he did a lot of tests on memory and figuring out how long we retain things, how quickly we forget things, with a massive sample size of 1. He was the subject. He tested himself trying to memorize nonsense syllables, so just 2 consonants with a vowel in the middle, trying to memorize those. And unsurprisingly, over time, his memory for those nonsense syllables just dropped off. But Ebbinghaus's work has been repeated over and over in huge trials, and we all come to the agreement that over time you forget things. So if you've got a course in school that looks a bit like that, and I'm pretty sure that some of us have got course planners that look a bit like that, then what's happening when you finish the fractions topic, you could even do an end of topic test and they'll actually do quite well. But as soon as you move on to the next topic, time that you're into that next topic, the memory of the fractions work is dropping off and dropping off. And then when you finish the percentages topic and move on to expressions, the memory of the percentages stuff is starting to drop off and tail off. And so on and so on and so on. Now, we know this. That is kind of obvious. We do know this, which is why every now and then you might have a mid-term test or an end-of-term test or something, or maybe you do a homework task that brings in some of the stuff from before, which is great, because great teachers have always been doing the stuff that works. And all this stuff I'm going to talk to you about today is not a new idea as such, but I think we've got a little bit more clarity around where it's coming from and how it can be best used. So mixed homeworks, that's a great thing to do. Not end of topic tests, but maybe end of every 3 topic tests, bringing in stuff from the topic number 1. That's a different way of approaching it. Doesn't actually take any more time, doesn't take any more work, but can lead to bigger gains in learning. So by the end of the year, if you've forgotten all your fractions, you've forgotten all your percentages, you've forgotten all your expressions, you've forgotten everything, end of year exam, it's not pretty. And kids know that they don't remember it all, so what do? They cram it all in. And then they go and trick us in their end of year exam because they do reasonably well. Think, that's great, you know what, go off and have a 6-week summer holiday and come back knowing absolutely nothing. Carolina mentioned deep and durable learning, so that's Peps McRae, that's his phrase, but I think it's a really good one. So if you haven't seen that book, I'll put it up on the screen at the very end. It's a great one, and the reason it's so good is because it's really quite thin. So teachers can actually read the thing. I like thin books. So what Peps is talking about here is depth in terms of how sort of well you understand something, and durability is how long you're going to remember it for. So rote learning gets kind of bad press sometimes, but rote learning is really powerful and really useful. That's your times tables, for instance, or that quote that you learnt from Macbeth in school that you can probably still remember, or even more than that. I'm learning Spanish just now, funny that. And I'm thinking back to when I was in school, and I think, I wish I'd done Spanish for a start. In fact, I wish Spanish had been an option when I was at school, French and German, and I can remember the 3-minute speaking task that you had to do face-to-face with the teacher, telling them all about your brothers and sisters and your pets and where you're from. That is rote learning, that is drilled into my head. I don't understand anything about the structure of the phrases or the sentence or really about the language, but rote learning sticks. It's kind of good because you want something that's there without too much effort to recall, give you a bit of a backbone or a bit of a structure around the rest of the stuff. But if you can couple that with a deeper understanding, then with more depth, then you end up in this quadrant here, which is really what we're aiming for, this idea of long-lasting understanding. Unfortunately, with little depth and little durability, then you just get people that can maybe regurgitate something for a couple of days and then it's forgotten and that's gone. And you maybe have to ask yourself, was that learning episode worthwhile? Is it worth going through that learning episode if a week later or 2 weeks later everything pretty much has been forgotten? So this is one model of how our memory works, and you may have seen something like this before. I don't think anybody knows for certain, but I think this is the most commonly agreed kind of model here. At any one moment, you're dealing with a huge amount of sensory input. Right now, sitting in here watching this, you've got the visuals, you're listening to me, you've got the audio, there's the temperature in the room, there's a slight noise of traffic outside, there's the contact between your body and the chair, all of those things, the person falling asleep on your shoulder, all of those things, but you tune out what you don't need and you tune in to what you do want. That's your attention. But that requires effort. Giving attention requires effort. It's a choice that you're making, because you could look out the window and I wouldn't blame you, so it's okay if you want to. You could just look out the window and drift off. But it's a choice to provide attention, and I do tell pupils this. Giving attention is a choice, and it requires effort. Without attention, pupils, you're not going to get that much learning taking place. And you can do everything you want, dance around the front of the room, create all sorts of interactive fun lessons. But that somewhere, the hard-working teacher needs to meet the hard-working pupil, kind of meet halfway. So a little bit more elaboration on this. In the working memory, which has got a limited size, essentially, we're thinking around about 4 sort of cells in working memory just now that allow you to process things. That's the site of your sort of awareness and your thinking. That's where thought happens. A little bit like a processor. Long-term memory, as far as I'm aware, there is no upper limit on long-term memory. People will say things like, oh, I've learned so much over my life that to learn new things, old stuff has to fall out. But I don't think it works like that at all. As far as we're aware, there's more than enough capacity for a full and exciting human existence. Like I said, if you don't give attention to your sensory input, then it just goes straight away. But if you want to hold something in working memory, and for me coming to this building today and just getting my directions right and everything, this is a new experience for me. So I checked my message from Carolina, got the name of the building, and I had to rehearse it. I had to just keep it going in there, just in my head. I know that I'm probably going to forget that stuff, because I don't really need it beyond today, but I had to rehearse it. So rehearsal will hold things in working memory, but it doesn't necessarily transfer it into long-term memory. And again, if you don't rehearse these things, you're going to lose them. Long-term memory, some information can get lost over time, like the name of that actor in the film that you struggle to remember. If you don't remember it ever again, then it may well disappear for good. That's why retrieving it is such a powerful thing to do, because if you retrieve it back into working memory for some sort of processing, then you'll develop a stronger memory for it going forward, which is really quite exciting. What Robert Bjork talks about, he says a little bit of forgetting is good for learning. You actually want pupils to be almost at the point of forgetting things, and then provided they can successfully retrieve whatever it is, they'll build a stronger memory for that in the future. So we talk about storage strength and retrieval strength. I'm not going to go into too much of that just now. But I quite like that little model there. Hopefully that makes some sort of sense of the system and the way that our memory works. Oh yeah, just a little bit more on the retrieval there. But of course, I'm going to talk a little bit about retrieval practice and low-stakes testing and things like that when I go into that in a minute. So I've taken a gamble here, and I'm just going to zoom in on the working memory section here. And if you like these slides, you can absolutely have these, keep these, take them, use them, whatever you want to do. I drew all of this, so there's no copy. I haven't stolen this from anybody, so you can use this stuff. If we zoom in on working memory, then you can see there's a little bit more going on in there than just a bit of processing. So different sections doing different things. Like I said, 4 items, roughly speaking, plus or minus 2 perhaps. The good thing about the 4 items is that some of them could be just single grains of knowledge, but some of them could be entire chunks. So, for example, a chunk might be something like tying your shoelace. When you learnt to tie a shoelace, it was all very much which hand do I hold which one in, which one do I make the loop with, then I do this. And it was a sort of series of almost unrelated procedures. But the more you do that, the more that becomes a fluid single procedure. You can tie your shoelace whilst talking to somebody now, no problem. You don't need to give it any real attention because it's chunked. So the entire process of tying a shoelace can take 1 slot in working memory. Driving a car is another one. Remember how difficult that was when you started? Couldn't have the radio on. Oh, everything like thinking about this, thinking about the feet, thinking about all those different things. Compare that to now. Assuming that you're all experienced drivers, it becomes so automatic that the process of driving a car is almost 1 single chunk in your working memory. I don't know if you've ever had this experience when you're maybe driving to a new place. That's me today again. Radio on, enjoying it on the familiar roads. Start to get to the destination that's unfamiliar. You're looking around, you're starting to think. And what do you do to the radio? Turn it down. Now that's actually an automatic response to free up a bit of working memory space. I don't want to have to give any attention to the music of the radio now. Get rid of that so I can concentrate on the task at hand. And I think I'm right in saying this, but when somebody is asked a tricky question or they're trying to remember something from their past, their eyes tend to just drift off up somewhere. You've noticed that? Perhaps you've maybe even done that. The eyes sort of, I'm thinking, what is that? And I believe that's because, again, an automatic response to kind of shut down the visual input into your mind, because you don't really look at anything, just sort of staring off into space, so that working memory can process whatever the task is at hand. So all these things are really quite interesting, really quite fascinating. So let's have a quick look at these sections. You're using this just now because you're listening to me, you're hearing this. And again, also we've got this visual now. I've deliberately tried to create quite a simple looking, nicely color-coded visual here for you to try and illustrate this, because you can take in the idea of a flow, the idea of something opening up with more complicated, interrelated things. You can see that from the visual, but you can also listen to me describing it to you. And those two channels kind of work at the same time, which is quite useful. Those two channels will work at the same time. What doesn't work really well at the same time is a slide with a whole lot of text on it and somebody reading it to you. Then you're getting sort of interference down the same channel. We talked a little bit about chunking. All that sort of stuff goes on in the episodic buffer. And then that final section, back to long-term memory, and I do like that image of long-term memory being more like a forest than a library. Because just like a forest, some paths are better trodden than others. Some paths are thick, the ones that are used most often, some are thin. And actually, if you don't follow a path for long enough, the path will just disappear. So I think that's quite a nice little image there, rather than some sort of filing cabinet system, which I think some people might feel working memory is. So that's kind of adapted from David Dida and Nick Rose's book there, but to be honest, I think that's a nicer graphic. Okay, so you've all heard of retrieval practice, sure. And the big dogs behind retrieval practice here, Rodiger and Losky, these guys have done a lot of work on it, and just searching on Google, you'll get lots of articles and lots of evidence behind there. It's not a new idea. I think I said great teachers have been doing a lot of this for many, many years, even way back in 1906. The idea that trying to recall a fact from your own memory is better for your learning than somebody just telling it again, or maybe you're reading it off a page. So different forms of retrieval practice, things that great teachers do all the time anyway. Questioning is fine, asking questions of a class, absolutely. Retrieval practice through homework, multiple choice quizzes, Hinge questions, exit questions. All of these things. A free recall, I don't know if you've encountered that or not, but it's basically just a blank bit of paper, write down everything you know about whatever the subject might be, just that idea of free recall. A nice little task that you can do. Doesn't lend itself to maths that well, but I do some of this work with colleagues in my own school, and what I like to do is write down everything you know about retrieval practice, so they'll start to write out everything they seem to remember about retrieval practice. And then what we would do is then pair up with somebody and say, well, did they have something that you didn't have, and vice versa? If so, write it down, but highlight it in orange. And then we'll get a more complete sheet, but you'll have something highlighted in orange. And then what I will do is then sort of bring everyone together and say, well, these are all the things that we know. If there's something else that wasn't on your sheet, write that down onto your sheet now, but highlight it in red. So what they've then got is a sheet which shows everything about retrieval practice, the things that they had to come up with a partner, and the things that they just didn't know. It's quite a nice little task, because it kind of lends itself to metacognition, that idea of knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know. Flashcards are good, and I'm pretty certain that if I was to ask you whether you thought pupils making their own flashcards up would be more beneficial than you providing the flashcards, you might feel that pupils making up the flashcards would be a more beneficial thing, but as far as I'm aware, there is no real difference to the amount of learning that can take place whether the pupils make up the flashcards or not, because really I think it's all about the learning what's on the cards rather than necessarily creating them. So here's one of Rodiger and Karpik's experiments that they did. What happened here, you've got three groups of people. The black bar folk, well, they did 4 periods of intense studying. So by studying, we're talking about rereading, or possibly rewriting, or looking through examples. So studying by looking at how it's done. This second group did 3 periods of studying followed by 1 period of testing. So self-testing, actually covering it up and saying, well, what is the capital of France, or whatever it might have been. And then this third group, the study, then test group, they looked at the people, read all the material, looked at the examples, and then just closed all that and tried practice questions. So on a test after 5 minutes, this is maybe what you might expect to happen, because that black bar, the grammars, it was all in there. But then look what happened after 1 week. You can see a huge drop-off in the amount that was retained by the study group, and then actually a better memory for the material from those who took part in the self-testing. Now again, this probably makes sense. You've maybe even had experience of this. When you're trying to memorise something, maybe you fold over that page, say, what did that say? And then self-test yourself in that way. But that can be useful in the classroom. So how do my retrieval practices work? Well, it's really important that there are no stakes or low stakes. It's not as a grade attached to this. It's about a tool for learning rather than a tool for reporting. Or it is an assessment in some sense, but it's not going to be used in any way as a tool for reporting. I would do them as often as possible. Can't do too much retrieval practice. It helps retention, it helps with facts, it helps with transfer. And with transfer, what we're talking about is using the knowledge that you're learning here in an unfamiliar situation further down the line. All of the studies that have been done back up all of these things. Benefits all learners. So by that, what we mean is that your weakest pupils or your most able pupils will all see a benefit if they use retrieval practice. They're just at different starting points, but they will, both groups will benefit. What's great is that it does encourage self-testing, which is such a powerful strategy for learners to do at home. And it's interesting because we've just finished a round of end-of-year exams at my school, and we encourage the pupils to write how they've done and do a bit of reflection on what went well and what didn't go so well, and what they're going to do in the future to try and do better in their assessments and their tests. And one of them said, I'm going to make my own retrieval practices, which I thought was great. So he went through a whole year of doing them with me, and then he moved to an environment where he didn't do so many retrieval practices, but he remembers that this was helping him. So he's now going to make his own retrieval practice, which is really nice. And then this last one, maths anxiety, or math anxiety, if you're in the States, is a thing. And you can be diagnosed with it, which is a shame. Maybe that's the 57% of pupils at the very beginning there. Frequent no-stakes testing has been shown to reduce that anxiety and in the high-stakes end-of-year exam. And I've certainly had pupils who have said to me, well, our end-of-year exam was fine because it felt just like we were doing another retrieval practice. And even that in itself is quite a powerful reason to introduce more testing, which is funny because we don't want more testing, but I'm actually saying more testing can be beneficial if it's sold in the right way, and that's why it must be low stakes. So how does this actually look in my class? Well, as I said, I'll do them as often as possible, fortnightly, every 3 weeks. You're having to sacrifice teaching time to do this test. It's a big investment to make, but I'd encourage you to try it. Because then you're going to have these, instead of the study group, you have the study test group. You get those benefits of better retention. I usually give them 10 or 12 questions, not too many. I want it all finished in the lesson, definitely. I want them finished, all of them finished, so regardless of the speed that they work at, so there's no time element to it. And just keep saying to them, this is you showing me what you can do. This is you showing me what you can do, so I can decide what we should learn together next, what we should work on next. Although actually for me it's about trying to harness the power of the retrieval effect. I get them to attempt each question, and after each question I get them to predict how confident they are in terms of whether they're going to get it right or get it wrong. Now, learners are notoriously poor at judging how good they are at something, but I still think there's value in doing that, and I'll show you how I do that in a minute. They mark their own, and the reason that I want them to gauge their confidence and then mark their own is because if somebody's really, really confident and then looks at the solutions which I give them and realises they're wrong, then we're hoping to try and take advantage of what's called the hypercorrection effect for them thinking, I really thought I knew this, but actually no, look at that. That kind of cognitive shock, hopefully the right way of thinking. And I use a Google form for analytics. And basically the pupils do everything. This is what's great about this model. Pupils do all the hard work. So let me show you what I mean by an example retrieval practice. So 10 or 12 questions printed on a sheet of paper, write on the answers, and we've got this thing over here, this kind of matrix over there. So they've all got a highlighter, red and green, and I get them, after they've done each question, to highlight in the expected column whether they think green, it's gone well, or red, I know that I've made a mistake here. And then they go on to question 2, attempt it, and then predict, attempt, attempt, predict. Once they're finished, they mark it using the model solutions, and then they can go down the actual column and shade in green or red whether they actually got it right or wrong. What we're hoping is obviously for a full matrix of green, but that's very rare for that to happen. What you actually end up with is stuff that looks like this. Now, there's no science really behind this other than my sort of sample size of 28 and my studies of my class, but it does seem to me that boys tend to be more confident and girls tend to be less confident. I'm not saying that is the case, but that does seem to me that that's what happens. Girls seem to not have quite as much belief and then tend to actually end up doing a bit better than boys. But over time, it's really interesting. This happened. Over time, they get better at predicting what they've got right and what they've got wrong until you get to that. That's so powerful, because there again is some metacognition. There's that idea of, I'm confident with what I know, I understand what I know, and they do know it. And also able to identify the ones that they know have gone wrong and the ones that they know they need to work on. So what's really great about this is that whatever question 4 was on and number 9 was on, that child, that learner, can then go away and focus some extra work on those specific questions. I said I'd get them to do a Google form, and I've said this before, but other forms are available. And we'll just get them to enter got it or not yet. Not how many marks, not right or wrong, just got it or not yet. Carol Dwight could be delighted with the use of not yet there, but I think it is actually quite powerful. So they take no time at all to key that in and get them to use their phones, iPad, whatever it is. You can do this at home if you want to. Again, the Google form's easy, done online. They're keying in the numbers and I get this back. So Google spits that out for me, and I can say, well, for my class, question number 1, find the percentage of amount. I'm pretty happy with that. Nearly 90% get it right. For me, that's a success. Over 80% for me, I'm quite happy that the majority have learnt it. Ideally, you'd want 100, but you'll find if you try this, it's quite hard to get 100. And if you're getting 100%, then the question's too easy. Anyway, nobody's learning anything from it. So that for me is great. This, I'd be looking at that saying it's okay, it's less than 80%, so I need to do something about this. Maybe I'll just put it into another retrieval. I'll put it into next week's retrieval in the hope that having done it here and marked it and gone through the process that they will have learnt, or at least reactivated their knowledge behind that. Anything less than 50%, then I have to own that. I'm afraid I take ownership and say my teaching has not been successful yet. And we'll go back and we'll do another lesson on that. We'll go back and we'll reteach that. So then, what you can do if you have regular retrievals and the pupils can keep them all in a nice folder, they keep everything in a nice folder, is get something like this going. So it takes a bit of organisation, obviously, but the questions relate to any one of these kind of key topics. And over time, and you can see the dates have been entered here of when they appeared in different retrieval tests, over time the pupils can highlight how they got on with those questions. Now, you might notice that we've got red, amber and green on there. So what I've done there is given them the chance to say red if you just don't know what to do with that question. If it was a disaster, took the wrong approach, you just didn't know how to start it. But amber is for something like a kind of casual error or a minor error. So having looked at the solutions, you know you were on the right track, but you made some sort of small, minor arithmetic error. And then green is obviously something that's quite strong. So I build this for the class, they build it for each other, and I can use that to know that I need to go back and do a little bit more of these sort of topics. Eventually what you're hoping for, though, is that everything starts to become green. And then I wouldn't include these things in retrievals for a few weeks, maybe 3 weeks, maybe put another one in as long as it's all green, then I wouldn't include it for 6 weeks. So an expanding retrieval schedule like that for things that have been well learned. So actual quotes from actual living kids. I do quite a lot of surveys and things with them just to see how this is going. And I think it's quite nice to hear it in their own words, sort of things that they're saying. It's a challenge at first, but then it got easier. That's quite nice as well, isn't it? Improved mainly because of the retrieval. It's given us a stronger memory. That's what we want to hear. But also this, I mean, aware enough to notice that it helps us remember what we've learned, but also to check if we're improving. So again, that ownership between the pupils in control of what's happening there. So I'm going to move on to talk about fluency and the illusion of fluency. So being fluent in something, the best way I can think to describe it is being able to speak a foreign language. If you can speak a foreign language pretty much without thinking, then you're fluent in it. If you're like me, stumbling through Spanish, forgetting every word, then I'm not fluent. Fluency is being able to do something without having to really give it any attention, like driving the car, tying the shoelace. We're fluent in those things. And overlearning, well, overlearning is defined as being repeated practice after one successful trial. So let's just say we were adding fractions and you managed to do a couple of mistakes, get one right. Then the next one is classed as overlearning, or I'm going to call that overlearning. So doing more after you've got one correct. You've maybe seen this page of Jotter full of, I don't know, divisions, single digit division, something like that. Lovely big page full. It's all ticked, all ticked. Students like that. Students like a big page of ticks. Teachers, they love a big page of ticks because people are learning stuff. This is great, but I have to ask, is it durable learning or is that just performance? What happened in this Doug Rohr experiment, he had two groups of learners, the low learners doing a low number of trials, so they actually just did just practiced 5 questions, that was it. Whereas the high learners did 20 of the same thing. So instinctively, 5, is that going to be enough? Surely 20, that's going to hammer it home. That'll fine, they'll have learnt that really well. And what happened then is when they were sort of tested and when their accuracy was measured, you can see that after 5, both groups are doing reasonably well. But after 20, the high learners, they're right up there at the top. So the question is, what happens over time? And this is what happens over time. So on a test 1 week after, then you can actually see that the high learners, it's stuck. It's still there. It's still there. They talk about reminiscence. This sort of just keeps sort of floating around for a spell of time. What they did here, the 20 practices of this has stayed in there. But 3 weeks later, and then 9 weeks later, you have to ask the question, what was the value in doing 15 extra questions? If 9 weeks later, they're both pretty much at the same level of retention. So I'm not saying just do 5 questions of each type of skill throughout maths. I want them to do the 20 questions. I just don't want them to do them all at the same time. I want to move those 20 questions around so that we can try and capture some of the benefits of spacing, which I'll come on to in a minute. So, as I said, practice is important, definitely, but spacing that practice is even better. So sometimes known as distributed practice. And the best way to describe it is the opposite of cramming. If you've got 4 hours to study for a test, do you do it all the night before? Yeah, well, you'll probably do all right in your test, but how much of that are you going to remember 4 weeks later, 6 weeks later? If it's the last test you ever do in a subject, then just go for it. Just cram it in and then forget it all the next day. But it's not it's a hugely popular strategy, and we've probably all done it. Probably all done it at some point, but it's not a long-term strategy. It's not a sensible long-term strategy. Summer holidays are a problem. Studying at the end of the summer term, doing some sort of end-of-year exam, cramming for that, and then having a 6-week summer holiday. The summer holiday forgetting is a thing. So same amount of study time, in fact not even as much, 3.5 hours, but dotted around over the preceding 2 weeks, over the preceding fortnight. So same amount of time, but this takes planning. This is where kids are not very good at this. Students are not really very good at planning like this. They need help and structure around preparing some sort of study calendar like that. So what happens? Well, they, onto that. The desirable difficulty, that little bit of forgetting that then kind of reactivates the memory, makes it a little bit stronger. I think this is really important. The harder you have to work at remembering something, the better you're going to remember it next time. As long as it hasn't been completely forgotten, otherwise we're in trouble. You need to be able to successfully retrieve that memory. Interestingly, getting a prompt to then allow you to retrieve the memory is still really powerful. That's not cheating, it still helps. Getting a little prompt, a clue, then I've remembered it, that's still a very powerful thing. So it's not cheating to sort of give them a little bit of a hint or a little bit of a tip. So here we go. This is what I was going to say about the spacers and the massers. So again, Doug Rohrer is, I think he's got a maths background, but he does a lot of studies in the mathematics context, and he's really very strong on this. He's not a big fan of overlearning at all, and he's a huge fan of spacing and of interleaving, which we'll come to in a minute. But what's happening here, we've got the red group, who are the massers doing a big block of practice, and we've got the spacers who have spread their practice out, essentially. And on the 1 week test, you can see that the massers, the crammers, they again did pretty well. The spacers, not too different, but over 4 weeks, you can see that really quite steep and marked drop off in retention from the massers, whereas the spacers have managed to hang on to a lot more. That drop off in remembering is nowhere near as steep. So if you're interested in these articles, just Google those things and you'll be able to find them somewhere. So that's my conclusion. Learn as least as much and retain it for longer, and that's what we need if they space out their practice. So it leads us quite nicely on to interleaving, which looks like that. Basically, that's the best way to describe it, is that diagram. You can either do a whole series of practice on the same thing, and then the next block of practice is on some different skill, but they're all the same, and then another block of practice on some new different skill. Or you can interleave all of those. So it's the same amount of practice on the same skills, just a different structure to the way that it's being done. So when we talk about interleaving questions, we talk about doing practice of questions where no two consecutive questions require the same strategy. Now, it's often seen that you'll get questions that have got a similar sort of surface to them, that they look quite similar, but that the deeper kind of process is a different one. So students are actually having to discriminate, what technique is it that I need to use here? So I use Darren Carter's Mr. Carter Maths, which is a great program. I don't know, has anybody seen that or come across that? He's got lots of auto-generating question sets, but what I think is really powerful is there's an option to create custom question sets. I don't know if you have done that as well. And so this is a custom question set, which I've created just to try and illustrate this idea of a similar surface to these questions. You can see that they're all involving algebra, that they all look kind of similar, but yet all three columns require a different technique to solve them. So similar surface, but a different deep structure there. There's another one, which just looks like a big page of square root signs, radicals. So Mr. Carter Maths, small subscription, but really powerful if you want to try and build question sets like this, because there aren't any textbooks like this. I'm going to forget what it's called now, come back to me. Homeschooling textbooks that are popular in America. It will come back to me, honestly. I'll retrieve this, the name of them. But they do something a little bit like this, but there's no textbook that I've seen in the UK that offers practice like this. So another little study, interleavers versus blockers. So either that group where they're doing a bunch of questions of the same type, and then another block of questions of a slightly different type, or the interleaved one where every next question is different to the last one. Same questions, different order, 88 days. They got a final review, which was actually an interleaved review. And I think it's important to note that because the unannounced test would be an interleaved test. That's how all our tests look. So the final review was interleaved because it followed the same format of the actual final exam. And well, yes, it did better. I think you know what's coming here. Even after just 1 day, the interleavers are having a higher success rate than the blockers in this case. But over time, over a month, then you see we've got much more retention for those who followed an interleaved program. And actually, Doug Rohrer has just quite recently released another study. Most of these say 2006, 2007, but this is 2019. So you can look up a larger study. They made a point of trying to get a much wider, more diverse group of students, still in a maths context though, and used a 4-month period where some of the learners did blocked kind of traditional practice, and some of them did interleaved practice. They got an unannounced test a month later, and you can see there, again, just replication of that finding that the interleaved group seemed to be doing much better, an effect size of 0.8, which John Hattie was here would tell you. That's a good thing. That's what we need. What was really interesting was that the teachers, in an anonymous survey, even before the results were released, the teachers said, this is really good. This feels really good. This seems to be working. And I know what they mean because I've been doing nothing but interleaved practice for the last 18 months. And you move on to teach a new topic and it requires prerequisites. Let's say we're adding fractions and we need them to be able to simplify fractions. We need to be able to do factors and multiples. If you do interleaved practice, when you come to teach a new topic, all of those skills just seem to be available, much more available than they have been any other point in my career. When I've tried to teach adding fractions, I've had to just go right back and say, right, what do we mean by a factor? What do we mean by a multiple? What's the numerator? But if they've done more interleaved practice, it just seems like we're better equipped for the new learning that's coming. So again, that's a live link, so you can just click on that one, it'll take you right to it. So it is harder because you have to keep making that choice as a student. You have to decide what technique do I need to use for this question, but better performance. So the double benefit, retrieval and spacing. It doesn't have to be superficially similar questions. You can have any sort, it still seems to be working. This interleaving works for questions that don't even look alike, which is great because it means that you can mix up all sorts of topics in the questions that you're teaching, and that's what I've done. That's kind of our sort of National 5-ish third year course, and I've been really precise in the way that I've tried to kind of granularize it and break it down into very clear skills, each one numbered there, and each one with a hyperlink to an interleaved exercise. So that takes a bit of work. But then what that creates are these interleaved exercises. Let's say lesson 50. Don't have a 50 on here, but let's say 50 was, I don't know, find the midpoint of a line segment, for example. So lesson 50 would be a lesson on how to find the midpoint of a line segment. But then I would only give them a few practice questions of finding the midpoint, 4, 6 maybe, just enough till everybody's managed to get 1 or 2 right. If they get 6 right, brilliant. As long as they're all getting 1 or 2 right. Because I don't want to go into that overlearning zone. I don't want to waste time practicing stuff. You know yourself, if you've watched pupils doing a lovely big page of Pythagoras, solving triangles using Pythagoras, you think you're doing really, really well. And they turn their jotter over because that page is full. You know what's coming, don't you? And then how do I do this? I mean, you can see that happening. What was the point of the previous page? Filled it, it looks lovely. I haven't remembered anything about how to do it. I quite often think pupils just start rubber stamping their work down the page, just like a big potato with a Pythagoras cut out of it, just stamping their way down the page, and there's no learning going on. So what happens, I still want to do the practice of finding the midpoint, but I just spread it out across the next few lessons practice. What's the rest of the lesson made up with? It's practice from things that we've done earlier. And if you look at those numbers carefully, you'll see that there's an expanding retrieval schedule going on there. you'll see that what's happening here, these are consecutive lessons or weeks, 5 weeks apart, 10 weeks apart, 20 weeks apart. You can see that it's still appearing in there, finding that midpoint, still getting a little go, but we're just expanding the time. So we're letting them forget it a little bit, then we're forcing them to retrieve it. I'm not sure of the optimum time between opportunities to retrieve. I think it probably does depend on the individual, and we can't get down to that level. Well, maybe with AI, maybe we could. I'll not say any more about that though, controversial. So they end up doing the same amount of practice, but they're doing interleaved practice. No danger of overlearning, no danger of an illusion of fluency. Like I said, Darren Carter's custom questions page is great. There's one of the ones that was in that sheet. It's the sort of thing they would do. So, nice big interleaved question set. They will have already done half a dozen questions of whatever lesson 32 was on. That's on a different sheet. We've done half a dozen questions of lesson 32, and then there's your practice. It's also great for homework as well. And you can see what's happening. You know, we're bringing back in stuff that really matters. Why am I pointing when I've got this? Bringing back in stuff that really matters and just refreshing it. You can create great big interleaved exercises. I do like this slide because it does that. And that's an exercise. And it's all mixed up and it's all jumbled, and that's end of term revision. But what my classes can do is do just about every single question on that sheet before they go into their end of year exam. So they go into their end of year exam and they just go, this is great, because we've been working on it throughout the year. So these are all techniques that you might have seen, you might have heard of, and I'm not going to spend that much time going through any of them, but they all kind of stem from results from cognitive science. A lot of them are trying to take advantage of the worked example effect, which is not a new idea. If you want to teach somebody mathematics, a really good way of doing it is to show them a worked example of it. But also some of this takes advantage of the self-explanation effect, which is actually very powerful. And you may have shared this experience where maybe in university you were sitting looking at usually your lecturer's textbook, that was the sideline, wasn't it? And trying to figure out, how's he gone from that line to that line? Trying to figure out how that, there's nobody there to help you, you're pouring in. Eventually you make that step, that's huge. And for me, that's what I think the self-explanation effect is, where you actually figure it out for yourself. That's really powerful. And that's what things like Silent Teacher allows you to do. So I'm conscious of time. Well, I'm not really sure what time it is, but I think it's probably close to wrap up. 1 minute to go. Brilliant. Well, I told you I had 87 slides or something like that. We're not going to quite get through them all, but you know where to find them. The next few slides we're going to just go through how I use example problem pairs, which is essentially the red bits are what the pupils are doing. So I'll do this and they'll do the red bits, but more powerful than that is this idea of backward fading. So what's happening is I'm removing steps at each stage of the example. So I would give them that, say you fill in the rest. And once we filled in that, I would give them that, which has got fewer steps than the one before, and they would fill it all in. You see, they haven't had to find a common denominator yet, but in the next one I'd give them this, still give them the structure. They're doing all the work. And then finally, I would say, you know, that's it, that's what you're getting. So the last one, the last example we do as a class, they basically do themselves. So if you want to see this again, speed through it. I honestly do it. That is my handwriting. I'd take some photos of it. The Silent Teacher thing, oh, we're going to get through all of this. We'll just let her explain what Silent Teacher is. Yeah, seems weird, but it works. And sometimes he points. So I'm just trying to tap into that self-explanation effect. I quite often say to them, do you have something in your mind that you think I'm going to write next? Can you visualize it on the board? What do you think I'm going to write next? Sometimes even say, what colour is it? And they'll all say blue. I do all my board work in blue. So they are visualizing something. And then when you write it, was that what you thought? Oh, or yeah, that's what we thought. You're getting some feedback in that sense. I think it was Graham Nuttall in his book, The Hidden Lives of Learners, where he said something like, by age of 11 or 12, children have learned that their job is to come to school and watch their teacher work. And I don't want that. I want them to be doing the work, so they need to be thinking. Silent teacher, I don't know, it doesn't slow it down. We go at the same pace, but all that extra sensory stuff stripped out, his quiet room, going through the steps is helping this individual. So there's some reading. If you fancy that over the weekend, some good stuff there. All I really need to say just now is that it's been an absolute pleasure coming through and talking to you, and I hope you found that interesting. The last thing I'll do, I did say I would put this up. Those are 4 books that I think are really worth getting into. It depends if you're teaching maths. This thing's not bad. There's some nice illustrations in that one up there. And again, that book from Gemma Sherwood is really good as a maths teacher. Saxon was the name of the publisher. Saxon books that are used in America for homeschooling, they are heading toward being something that's got some interleaved exercises in it, but not really fully there. There, look at that. Retrieval in action.